Welcome to the British Library. Tonight's event is part of a series accompanying our smash hit blockbusting exhibition, Medieval Women. Yes, and you've obviously already been. Medieval Women. Yeah, it is. I don't know why, I feel like I'm taking credit for it. It's Medieval Women in their own words, and it really has been a big hit with people. And with the people that work here in the library as well, we're all just so excited about it. If you haven't been, I really hope you get the chance to go. And of course, the events have been fantastic as well. We've been so lucky. And many of you have been repeat offenders coming back again and again to our events programme. So thank you so much. And hello to our online audience as well. It's lovely to have you there. You can, of course, put your questions in at any time because we'll have time for questions later. If you've got any, just pop them in the box beneath the screen. So, as I mentioned, tonight is about medieval women in their own words. And one of the many things that I've learnt from this exhibition is how much medieval women moved around, and not just the elite ones as well. So we'll be looking into this idea of pilgrimages, sacred and profane, in tonight's conversation. But I'm delighted to let you know that we've got a treat in store before that conversation happens. We'll be welcoming back our very own Kate Arnold, whose work you enjoyed as you were coming in. Kate's going to come back and play for us just for a very short set and talk a tiny bit about her work. Kate Arnold bases her music around the hammered dulcimer, which you've already heard, and other medieval and Renaissance stringed instruments. She's classically trained on violin and vocals, and she previously fronted a punk baroque band. I really want to join your band, Fear of the Forest. Kate is following her two-part electro-medievalist album, Rota Fortunae, with a new album drawing on material encountered during her PhD research into medieval French and Arabic songs. And all of this merch is on sale. So when you come for the signings to buy all of the fabulous books, you can also buy Kate's music. So please will you join me in welcoming her back onto the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've lost my hammers. There they are. I won't speak for too long because I'd like to let the music speak for itself. But this is the hammered dulcimer, hence the hammers, and it is originally a medieval instrument. I've obviously had a few little alterations made so that you could hear it going through the loops and all the electro stuff earlier on. I'm going to pare it right down now, and I'm going to sing two songs. The first, some of you may have already heard, because this is one of the most well-known medieval songs by a woman, for which the melody has survived. Quite a lot of melodies have survived for the stuff that the men wrote, but this was written by a Troubadourits. So these are the female troubadours of southern France. Béatrice de Dia, and she wrote this in something like 1180, and it's a song about how she's basically being ghosted by her lover. And I'll just quickly run through the translation for you. I must sing about something I would rather not. I'm so angry with the one I love, because I love him more than anything, but neither mercy nor courtesy moves him. Neither does my beauty, nor my worthiness, nor my good sense. For I am deceived and betrayed, almost as if I were ugly. I wonder at how you've become so proud, friend, towards me, and I have reason to lament it's not right that another love takes you away from me, no matter what is said or granted to you. And remember how it was at the beginning of our love. Never may it be God's will that through my fault we should separate. My worth and my nobility should help me, my beauty and my fine heart. So I send this song to you so that it can be my messenger. For I want to know, my fair and noble friend, why you're so cruel and wicked to me. I don't know if it's pride or ill will. But I especially want you, messenger, so she's talking about the song, I want you, messenger, to tell him that many people suffer for having too much pride. Chantar merde socio no volria ta me rancor de lui qui soia mia caria ola mais que noia ren que sia Fast we non val merces ni cortesia. Ni ma beltats, ni mos breits, ni mos sens. Catresim soi anganade traia. Cum degresseis io fos desavinens. Me cum vostre cors orgoia, amics vas me perchierat son chem doia. Non es sheid, straits cautra mors vos mi toia. Per noia ren ceus dia, nia coia. E membre vos cals vols comensaments di nostre amor, ja domne Deus non voia, che ma colpa sia departiment. Valer mi Dio, mos prezzi, mos parages, ma beautats e plus mos fins corages, percio vos man laiones vostre stages, esta chanson que me sia messages. E voi saber lo mios bels amics gens, perché vos mets tan fers ni tan salvages. No sei si seis orgois o mal talents. Meis ai tan plus voi li digas messages, qu'entro d'orgoi an grand an mein tasgens. Thank you very much to the Countess Beatriz de Dia, who gave us that song. And what I find really interesting about that is this image of the song actually as a messenger that's probably going to get there before she does, and it's the song that's doing the travelling there. On the theme of travelling, again, of course, women moved around for lots of different reasons. I'm going to sing a song in Arabic now. And this is an 8th century poem by Maysoon bint Bahdal. It may be by a different Maysoon. It might be Maysoon bint Jandal, but from around the same sort of time. And she is travelling because she has been promised in marriage to the Caliph. So this is an example of something that happened quite a lot. Women were obviously travelling and being given in marriage to people in order to cement these political alliances. But she came from the tribe of Kalb in the Syrian desert. So what she's doing in this song is she's comparing her new life of luxury in the palace of the Caliph to her life back home. And hopefully you'll get the kind of feelings behind it, but just a couple of lines. She says things like, a house in which souls throb and flutter is dearer to me than a lofty palace. Eating breadcrumbs in a nook of my house is dearer to me than eating a whole loaf in a palace. And the roughness of my life among the Bedouin is more desirable to my soul than this life of luxury. I only want my homeland back, for my homeland seems to me a noble country. لبيت تخفق الأرواح فيه أحب إلي من قصر منيف وكلب ينبح الطراق عني أحب إلي من قط ملوف لأمرد من شباب بني كلاب أحب إلي من شيخ شيخ عنيف ولبس عباءة وتقر عيني أحب إلي من لبس الشفوف وأكل كسيرة في قصر بيتي أحب إلي من أكل الرغيف وأصوات الرياح بكل فج أحب إلي من نقر الطفوف وخرق من بني عم نحيف أحب إلي من علج أليف خشونة عيشتي في البدو أشهى إلى نفسي من العيش ظريف فما أبغي سوى وطني بديلا فحسب ذاك من وطني الشريف.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing. We were just saying that as we walked on. What a wonderful way to start the evening. It's so wonderful to see you all here. My name is Dr. Shazia Jagot. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of York, and I'll be chairing this discussion this evening with some fabulous interlocutors, as we'll be talking a little bit about medieval women and their pilgrimages and travel in all kinds of different ways. So I'll start off just by introducing our speakers, and then we'll get started on our conversation. So sitting next to me is Sara Wheeler, who is a best-selling and award-winning writer of non-fiction books about travel and travellers. They include Terra Incognita, Travels in Antarctica, The Magnetic North, and Mud and Stars, Travels in Russia with Pushkin and other geniuses of the Golden Age. Sara is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and is published in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and other places. Next to Sara is Diane Watt, who is an award-winning writer and academic. She's the author of several books on medieval literature, most recently God's Own Gentlewoman, The Life of Margaret Paston, and is currently Professor of Medieval English Literature at the University of Surrey and co-director of the Sex, Gender and Sexualities Research Centre. She's also joint editor-in-chief of the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Medieval Women's Writing in the Global Middle Ages. Sitting next to Diane is Marion Turner, who holds the J.R.R. Tolkien Chair of English Literature and Language at the University of Oxford, where she is a Fellow of Lady Margaret Hall. Her last two books, Chaucer, A European Life, and The Wife of Bath, A Biography, both won multiple prizes. Last year, she curated the exhibition Chaucer, Here and Now at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So, we'll get started, I think. So we're here today to think a little bit about medieval women and travelling and pilgrimage. And I thought we would just kickstart the conversation with a question that I'm sure is on everyone's minds. But did women travel in the Middle Ages? Who were these women who travelled? Where did they go? And why would they travel? And we can also think a little bit about what makes them different from the reasons we might travel today as well. And if you've got a favourite traveller that you want to kind of bring into conversation now, that would be wonderful too. Or, who would like to kickstart? Marion.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think women travelled so much more than people often imagine. In fact, in general, medieval people travelled a lot more than a lot of people imagine. And so we see women travelling on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to Italy, to Spain, to Santiago, Rome, to those great pilgrimage sites. We also see them travelling for business at times. They would be trading, they would be negotiating with people. We see them, as Kate was saying, we see higher class women travelling for marriage and those kinds of things. But when we're talking about pilgrimage, we're often thinking about many different kinds of pilgrimages. So you've got your big glamorous pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which is going to take you months and you're going to be travelling across the seas. But there's also local pilgrimages. And a lot of, less well-off women, they might not be going, they certainly weren't going on these very long distance pilgrimages, but they might well go on little local pilgrimages. And there are some pilgrimage sites, so St Fried's in Oxford, for instance, but also others, St Godric's up near Durham, where it looks like from the offerings and the records, more women went to those sites than men. So certainly women were doing all kinds of different things, even though there were probably a smaller proportion of women going on the long distance pilgrimages than men.
Yeah, so kind of moving between the local and the global in those ways too, yeah.
I think I'd like to add to that as well, that in the early Middle Ages in particular, women also travelled to be as missionaries. So in the 7th and 8th centuries, women were travelling from England to the Germanic lands to join St Boniface on his mission to convert the pagans to Christianity. And in fact, one of my favourite, you asked who our favourite pilgrims are. One of my favourite pilgrims is a woman called Hugeberg, who she was an English woman. She was a nun. She was part of the convent at Heidenheim. And what's remarkable about her is that she wrote an account of her kinsman's pilgrimage, St Willibald, and he travelled from England across Europe to the Holy Land, and she writes a very detailed account based on his eyewitness account, his personal narrative, which he had related to Hugeberg. But she describes it in incredible detail. But she's very much an armchair traveller, so she isn't able to go. She isn't able, well, it's not quite clear why she didn't travel herself. Perhaps she wasn't able to travel herself. But she gives this very detailed account of Willibald's travels, without having sort of set foot beyond her convent walls, which I think is an absolutely fascinating example.
Yeah.
A woman traveller who was an armchair traveller.
Yeah, I was just at the British Museum at the Silk Roads exhibition. Willibald and Hugeberg are there at the kind of the end. I got very excited. Yeah. Sarah, what about you? I mean, how do you think about medieval women, but also kind of you as a traveller today? I mean, the things that you've learned about medieval women travelling that resonate with your own experiences or seem quite different from your own experiences?
Well, I think they went to get away from the kitchen sink and to glimpse something that was more important, and that's why I go. And I think what really leapt out at me from this exhibition was how much of their stories resonated with me. And I saw far more similarities than differences. I think that's why women have always gone, those two reasons. And it made me feel also that for women travelling, the sacred and the profane are very much bundled up together. Yeah. It's not two separate things. I might pick out Egeria, because she was the first woman traveller who's left a record. Yeah. Before the ones we've seen in this exhibition, in the 4th century CE, she rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. And she wrote back this wonderful series of letters to her girlfriends, who were probably nuns, in Latin. But unlike the male voices of the classical era, she speaks with a great fireside affection, like she addresses them, "Dear ladies, lights of my light, fire of my heart." And she describes everything she sees around her. She complains a lot, like I do. Says that Euphrates is too wide. And she says that Akbar's tomb is old-fashioned, which was quite something in the 4th century CE. And she expresses the most extraordinary delight when she gets to a hostel and meets a woman she met down the road. Her trip was 3 years. Those were the days, eh? But I think that it's the preoccupations of the daily and you know, all these women, they were dealing with the same things that we deal with, falling in love, that horrible guy who had too much pride that Kate was singing about, parents dying, being ill. And it's the universality of it going all the way through that I see in the words of these medieval women.
I think, as you say, we were talking there about the trip that took 3 years. Like, a big difference is, of course, how long it took to get places. And, you know, you asked about, you know, the favourite medieval pilgrims. So one who's really interesting is Margaret of Beverley from the 12th century. And some of her story is undoubtedly fictionalised, but it also reveals all kinds of truths. So she was born in Jerusalem because her parents were on pilgrimage, and then she went back there later, and she was allegedly there in 1187 when Saladin took Jerusalem, and then, you know, all kinds of things happened to her. And we know about her from a poem, and she, you know, she allegedly was kind of fighting Saladin with a cooking pot on her head. And these things are probably not true. But some of the interesting things about her story are, because then we think about, wow, so her mother was travelling while pregnant, or got pregnant while they were travelling. And that that happened. You know, if you were a medieval woman and you were married, you were pregnant a lot of the time, you know. So you were still going to do things. You weren't going to think, I'm not going to go on this trip. And when we look in lots of different records, we find, say, in the English hospital, which is a hotel in Rome, there were records about, you know, if a woman is pregnant and gives birth here, you know, she must stay here until after the purification, you know, so let her stay for X number of weeks and so on. And so we have lots of records about the fact that, yeah, pregnant women were travelling. They weren't letting that kind of hold them back. They were getting on with things. So I think and also the other interesting thing about her story is that the danger, you know, that, you know, women did get caught up in wars and battles, and they kind of dealt with it. And, you know, maybe they didn't actually put their cooking pots on their heads, but, you know, they weren't put off from travelling by the fact that those kinds of things might happen. And if I can have another favourite medieval pilgrim, and I'm sure we could just talk about our favourites forever, but one of the ones that I think it's really interesting just to think about the more obscure medieval pilgrims. So a woman that I know Diane has also been interested in, has written about in the past, was the maid of Margery Kempe. And I'm sure we will talk about Margery Kempe in a bit, very famous medieval pilgrim. But her maid, whose name we don't know, but we know she travelled on pilgrimage with Margery Kempe. And she's interesting for a whole range of reasons. So when Margery Kempe went on pilgrimage, you had to travel with a group, again, because it was dangerous, particularly for women, because of risks of rape. So you would travel in a group. And people didn't like travelling with Margery. She annoyed them. And
so she tells us.
I mean, she tells us that she annoyed them, she says, for two main reasons. One was that she kept talking about God, and pilgrims hate that. The other was that she was a vegetarian. And pilgrims hate that too. You know, and these other pilgrims said, well, you can only stay and travel with us if you will stop talking about God and eat meat. And she said, well, no, those are absolute, you know, red lines for me. So off everyone else went. And her maid, who she was paying to go on pilgrimage with her, went with them, wouldn't stay with her. So this is an interesting example, again, of a woman who is on a pilgrimage, but she's there as part of her job. You know, she hasn't gone for a spiritual reason, though she may well have, you know, had spiritual desires, but that wasn't why she was there. Margery then catches up with her months later in Rome. She finds this woman who's now got a much better job, and she's working in that English hotel in Rome as the cellarer, the keeper of the wine. Really good job. She dispenses some charity to her former employer. But here's an example of a woman, and I think it goes back to what Sara's saying about getting away from the kitchen sink, that this woman finds opportunities in that space of travel where she can remake herself, get a new job, become someone more important. You know, it's offered these kind of opportunities to be a new person, which is also an interesting thing that people do when they get out of their normal lives. You know, they can be someone else. So I think she's really interesting for those reasons as well.
And I think as well as Margery Kempe's maid, we also have Margery Kempe's daughter-in-law, who actually travels to... So Margery Kempe's son settled in Prussia, and his wife and Margery Kempe's son both travelled from Prussia to England to visit Margery Kempe, and then the son unfortunately died, and Margery decided to accompany her daughter-in-law back to Prussia, which the daughter-in-law, again, wasn't very happy about. So again, we've got this unwilling companion. But that's an example of a woman who is traveling simply to accompany her husband, who is a merchant, who has family in England. So the daughter-in-law is not, she isn't given a name in the book, unfortunately, but the daughter-in-law is just traveling to accompany her husband for entirely secular reasons, not for pilgrimage. So there's again the idea of sort of women who are traveling for very practical reasons. But I was also reminded when you were saying about Sarah, about why women travel then and now, and if part of it is to get away from everything, it's not just necessarily just going on pilgrimage for religious reasons. And again, going back to the letters that were exchanged between St. Boniface and his missionary followers, including a significant number of women, some of the women talk about that. They ask Boniface's permission to go on pilgrimage, and they say that they want to go on pilgrimage to escape the pressures of running a convent you're being the head of a convent, and they need to get away from work, and they need to get away from the sort of pressures of the home life. There's too many demands being made on them. So they see pilgrimage as an escape, as you say, just as we see travel now.
Yes, I think that's why the sacred and the profane are so bundled up. Julian of Norwich, I think we'll probably talk about a bit, because she featured so much in the exhibition. And what I got from her writing was this business of observing. You go to observe things, they're going to take you to another place. And do you remember, it was in the exhibition, it was when she was ill, and somebody put a hazelnut in the palm of her hand. And she says, I look at this with my eyes of understanding. And she saw this tiny thing there, and she said it was very much a ball. And I see the world, and I see that God made it. And she saw something in that. And if you think about the world as a ball like that, we all think of that image so familiar to us, don't we? Taken from space, of the blue and the white, the planet. But of course, she'd never seen that, as she'd never seen so many of the things we've seen. And yet somehow, in that image, and I think again and again in women's travel writing, you see they're moving themselves forward on their spiritual journey through images and translating that to us by describing it.
Yeah, I think Julian of Norwich is a great example of somebody where we can think about movement on different kinds of planes of kind of, so she's moving through a kind of spiritual, almost kind of a metaphysical plane, because actually Julian of Norwich is immobile in many ways, right? She's an anchoress. She's kind of decided that she's going to shut herself off from the world and live in a very small space and not do the kind of movement that Margery Kempe is doing, kind of all over the place. And yet she's able to kind of visualize the world and take herself on a journey, right? On this kind of spiritual journey. And I think, yeah, so kind of journey and pilgrimage often works on both the kind of physical plane, but also that kind of spiritual, metaphysical plane, if that makes some sense.
Yes, and the records they left often enable other people to travel from the armchair, which many people want to do. It's a lot more comfortable, isn't it? And we can read and travel through them.
Absolutely, yeah. We've got lots of armchair travellers in the medieval period too. The most famous one is a man called John Mandeville, which we won't get into. But we've also talked a little bit about Hunneberg of Heidenheim too. There are two things, maybe. There are two directions we can go into. And I wondered if maybe we could carry on thinking a little bit about the practicalities of travel, which we've kind of talked a little bit about already, and the fact that these kind of long journeys, if you were going to the Holy Land, and the kind of the physical states a woman might be in, but also the kinds of things that you would need to facilitate that kind of travel, right? So you would need, I mean, today when you're getting ready to travel, you know that you need to have your passport, you need to have some currency, you need to know how long you're going for, where you're going to stay, and I don't know can we talk a little bit about what the records tell us about the kind of planning that would have gone into maybe a big, the big travel that you would do, right? The kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to go to Jerusalem, for instance.
Yeah, so we have examples of women getting say, licenses to take certain amounts of money abroad, or to take letters of exchange from bankers, which they could get different currency from those bankers' representatives in other countries, for example, or getting or simply getting letters of permission from their priest to say they were licensed to go and travel. So we see those kinds of documents. So it's not always the same kind of document for everyone, and a more important person might have letters of protection, or, as I say, be taking larger sums and so on, or even be able to have these kind of banking letters of exchange, which gives you a bit more protection over your currency. So you see people taking those kinds of documents, but also just, they did need a lot of stuff. And again, you see particularly better off people with, horses, and to carry all the stuff that they've got. You've got to take your things like your bedding, for example. If you're going on the boat over to the Holy Land, you need a lot of food and pots and those kinds of things. A lot of that stuff you're taking with you.
And there's a letter in the Boniface correspondence, which is actually a letter of introduction for a nun who is going on pilgrimage, and it's written by her, the abbess of a convent. And the letter is written to another abbess in Germany. So this nun would have been travelling basically from convent to convent. The convents would have formed stopping places on the route to Rome and to Jerusalem. And the letter requests that she should be given suitable supplies, her supply should be replenished, that she should be given directions as the route to take, and basically she should be given material as well as spiritual help on this journey. So those sorts of letters of introductions would also then have been important documents akin to perhaps our tickets or our passports today.
When we were talking about this talk in advance, preparing it, we spoke about how difficult it was for the women travelling in those days, and Diane said they didn't have GPS, and I said, well, we didn't have that in 1979.
It was also really hard to be a vegetarian abroad like 10 years ago too.
Things went on changing. There's the Victorians, of course, women were great travellers. There's this sort of doughty tweed-skirted tribe who you see drawings of them, don't you, on the top of a palmyre with a, flag aloft or umbrella aloft. There's an exhausted retinue of factotums behind them, usually. But one of them, probably one of the best known, Isabella Bird, who was published by John Murray, who published most of the Victorian women travellers. And she wrote to him one time when she was away, saying, could you send me a tin bath to the one of those claw-footed things to the, wilds of Iraq? And he did.
How long did that take?
Not a stunt I would try and pull off myself. Although if anyone from Faber is here, we might give it a try.
I think on the issue of women travelling and this sense of that the sacred and the profane being all bound up together, I think that's a really important thing for us to kind of unpack a bit more, because I think that historically people wanted to think of female travellers as profane, and this goes back to endless misogynistic kind of rants about why women are travelling, and the idea from Proverbs in the Bible about the wandering woman, that for a woman to go outside the house and wander about was dangerous to society and to culture, and they're only doing it because they are uncontained and they want to gossip and they want to be sexually uncontained. And so I think there was a long history, and there's of course lots and lots of misogynist writing in the Middle Ages which says, women, when they go travelling, they come back pregnant, people who went off on pilgrimage are now prostitutes all over France. And that's being said back in the 8th century and goes on being said for a long time. But the kind of pendulum shouldn't then swing to it's all, that spirituality is somehow the opposite to that in actual fact you can have women who are going on pilgrimage because they do have spiritual needs and desires, but they don't think that should be separate from relaxing and enjoying themselves, and that is very reflective of medieval culture more generally, where you don't have this kind of separation, where people are making assignations and doing business in churches, and that's not because they're not religious, it's that they don't think those things have to be divided. So we see, I think, a lot of that kind of mixed travel where it's okay to pray and enjoy yourself.
Misogyny hasn't gone anywhere, But spirituality has been marginalised, and I think that that is one big difference we see. And throughout history, with this business of the sacred and the profane being bound up together in women's lives, there's no question that men have made the spiritual aspect profane, or turned it into something, you know, hysteria is the word often that comes to mind, or in other ways denigrated the spirituality, pushed it into the corner of the bonkers in order to marginalise women. It's, you know, an old tactic. And I think that the way that spirituality now, as opposed to the Middle Ages, has been completely marginalised is kind of only another part of that, because it's so off the agenda. Certainly in the developed world, spirituality is completely off the agenda, that women are often perceived to be slightly in that bonkers league if they have anything to do with it. And I'm sure that, you know, most of the audience would agree that this complete separation and division and the refusal to even allow the spiritual any role in our daily lives is regrettable and has taken us backwards. And there's no point in saying I would like to hope that will alter in the future, because we all know what's going to happen about that. But I think that both sides, misogyny came in, one in the medieval period when the spiritual and the diurnal, the material, were all part of the same thing, as they still are today in India. Much healthier state of affairs, I think. And now, where spirituality is completely marginalised, both of those states of affairs have been used to sort of weaponise women's role, I think.
Mm. I think we can see that sort of balance of the sort of spiritual in everyday life if we look at a figure like Margaret Paston, who, as far as I'm aware, only once travelled outside of Norfolk. So she lived in the 15th century in Norfolk. She did travel on pilgrimage. She went to the great pilgrimage site of Walsingham, and she also travelled to more local to pilgrimage sites which were even closer to home. St Leonard's Priory in Norfolk was one pilgrimage site she visited. But she wasn't somebody who was... She was someone for whom sort of religion was part of her everyday life, and spirituality was part of her everyday life. But she's very different to someone like Margery Kempe, for whom religion becomes her whole life. So I think Margaret Paston is an interesting example of the sort of woman who didn't travel on these long pilgrimages across. So Margaret Paston is an example of sort of woman who didn't travel on these long pilgrimages across Europe or to the Holy Land, but for whom pilgrimage was just part of the sort of spiritual everyday life of women in this period in history.
Can I just say, Margaret Paston, her maiden name was Bruce, is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so
no, that was her daughter-in-law, sorry.
Her daughter-in-law?
Yes,
okay.
That was Margery Paston.
Okay, so Margery Bruce, in this exhibition, is the first Valentine card, that's the earliest Valentine card that's ever survived. And she wrote to her fiancé, didn't she? My right beloved, you are my right beloved Valentine. Mm-hmm. So you can all write that in your cards tonight.
Very timely.
Maybe we can spend a little bit more time thinking about these local pilgrimages, thinking a little bit about where women would have gone on a local pilgrimage and how that might have been. I mean, how often would a woman go on a local pilgrimage? Do we have a sense of what they would do when they would go there? Were they going to particular sites for particular purposes, do we know? Or was it more about proximity than it was about a particular spiritual need?
I think it's a lot about proximity. There are, of course, the major pilgrimage sites. So if you're going to go to, if you've got the money, but you want to stay inside England, you're going to go to Canterbury, and next you're going to go to Walsingham, right? So there are the most famous pilgrimage sites but a lot of people, they would go locally. And there are some, as I briefly mentioned before, where we see more women going than men. So it does seem that there were some that were particularly attractive to women, and that's sometimes about the nature of the saint. I mean, very often when you see the offerings and things, so if you're going to these pilgrimage sites, you might well leave an offering, leave a kind of prayer. and so often people are going because of illness. They want to be cured. And if you think back to the Canterbury Tales and the idea that people are seeking the saint because he cures them when they are sick. And, that's the kind of the heart of the idea of the pilgrimage, whether that's a literal sickness or a metaphorical, spiritual sickness. But what we often see is that it is someone who is infertile or their child is ill. For women, you often see that, that they want a baby or they want their child to be cured. So, there are lots of evidence of that kind of as a reason for going on pilgrimage. So they might have particularly thought that a female saint would be, or the Virgin would be more likely to help them with those kinds of things.
And there's a fantastic letter, one of Margaret Pattonson's letters, where she discusses when her husband is ill in London, and so she and her mother-in-law Agnes are going to travel to Walsingham to pray for her husband's recovery, and the mother-in-law is going to buy a candle of the weight of her son as an offering. And I mean, that's a very big, heavy candle that Agnes of Paston was good. And these candles were sold in little stalls outside the pilgrimage sites. So you could go and you could buy the candle and go and light it. And often they'd be if you had, for example, a sore arm or a sore leg, and that's what you're going to pray for, you could buy a candle that was the shape of your arm or your leg. Or if you had a sick cow, you could get a candle that was the shape of your cow. So I always wondered whether Agnes Paston's candle was not just the weight of John Paston, but was actually the figure of John Paston. A sort of life-size model in wax.
She commissioned the sculpture. Yeah, I was going to save the souvenir question to the end, but we've already started talking a little bit about the kinds of materialities that come with kind of going on pilgrimage. So the kind of offerings that you would give. But people also bought things on pilgrimage on the pilgrimage route, also on the way back home, and thinking about the kinds of the kinds of souvenirs or the kinds of things that people would bring back home for people.
Yeah, and some things which are still famous today, like the scallop shell and things like that, from Santiago, there are particular things that are associated with particular sites. But people would very often, they would be getting pilgrim badges. And so you're going back and you're wearing your badge and people can see that you've been on that pilgrimage. And I mean, I'm back to the sacred and the profane, or really just the profane, because these pilgrim badges were very often obscene. And you have these extraordinary badges of, nuns with wheelbarrows of penises and things like that. So lots of obscene pilgrim badges. But then the one that I find really unpleasant but also interesting is that there is there's a badge from the late 14th or early 15th century, which is a vulva badge. And so it is a quite detailed image of a vulva as pilgrim. So it's a vulva with a pilgrim's hat, little shoes, a penis-shaped staff and a rosary in its other hand. And, I think this is a really important object because it's not just obscene, it is also misogynist. And the obvious meaning of this badge is that a female pilgrim is simply walking genitalia. That's all she is. She has no spiritual needs or desires. She has no brain. She is not of interest for anything other than her sexual availability. And the implication is, a female pilgrim is just there to have sex and is available for anyone who wants to have sex with her. She is literally a walking vulva, and that is, I think, it's a very significant kind of demonstration of how some people were thinking about the female pilgrim. And of course, and conversely, we have a lot of evidence of women pilgrims being very frightened of rape and, writing about that anxiety about being raped, the need to travel with lots of other people, the need to make sure there were other women in the room with them, that they were sleeping near them. Margery Kempe's extreme difficulty when her companions abandon her. You have this kind of polarization. I've got a bit away from your question about souvenirs, but I think it's we have these objects, and then the object tells us lots of other stories and lots of other aspects about how people were thinking about women and pilgrimage culture.
And other sorts of objects that you might buy as well, sort of badges, would be You could get the little sort of models of Jerusalem, for example, or you could get little dolls, sort of little Jesus figures. And the book of Margery Kempe, there's a description of an Italian woman who has a little doll that she gets out of the chest, and she dresses and kisses, and she puts on the other women's laps for them to nurse. So you could also get items like purchase items such as those, and you could purchase sort of ribbons that would be the measure of Christ's tomb. And Margery Kempe actually describes how when she comes back from Jerusalem, she demonstrates to the other pilgrims in her lodging the measure that Christ's tomb was. So you could see the size of it. But that also reminds me actually of my own visit to Jerusalem and to the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre, and we could to go in and visit to see Christ's tomb. And as I was queuing, I was just getting to the front of the queue, and the person behind me was getting very impatient, and she said, "For goodness sake, it's just an old stone." It's like, oh. So I think even today we get impatient pilgrims. I felt it was a Margery Kempe moment then when that happened.
What Marion says still has currency. I was just in Bhutan, and souvenir shops in one place in the east were just full of penises of all sizes and colours. And lo and behold, the most sacred temple in that village was full of penises and all the iconography. And of course, there's a story behind it and so on. And the place I was staying, trying to be gracious to its 21st century pilgrims, like to leave something on the pillow at night, and you can guess what it was. And I didn't really appreciate it.
But that's also interesting about thinking about the different kinds of cultures that women encountered when they travelled and how they responded to that. And I think, with Margery Kempe, and she is trying to tell stories about herself and her own persecution that may not all be historically true. But when she talks about travelling to the Holy Land, the way she talks about the Muslims she encounters is that they all love her and are really, really nice, and the evil people are all her companions who abandoned her and were horrible to her. And so, whereas she has nothing but praise for the, she talks about the kind of the Saracen who takes her around and is all kind and nice to her. So it's not the case that we're seeing people kind of necessarily being xenophobic. We also, of course, other times see xenophobia, but sometimes we see this kind of embrace to a certain extent of other cultures and peoples.
The kind of kindness of strangers, I always think with Margery Kempe, which is, resonant when you're travelling in a foreign land and somebody comes to help you. Maybe we can, we've got a bit of time left. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about Margery Kempe, who I think is fascinating from the perspective of the record that she leaves, but also for all the places that she goes to. So Margery Kempe travels to almost all of the big pilgrimage sites for a medieval Christian woman. So she goes to Santiago de Compostela, she goes to the Holy Land, and we know she goes to Rome, but she's also travelling a lot within England too, right? So, so she goes to York, she goes to Leicester, she goes to places where she's not particularly welcomed as well. And there's lots of ways that we can think about Margery Kempe as traveller. I think of Margery Kempe as a traveller, and I for my students, my second year students, I teach. There's a week where I teach Margery Kempe in conversation with a traveller from Morocco called Ibn Battuta, a really famous 14th century, a male traveller. But we read the sections where Ibn Battuta, who is from Tangiers, and he travels across to Saudi Arabia to perform the Hajj, which is a big pilgrimage for Muslims. And on his way, he goes to Jerusalem, and he tells us about his time in Jerusalem. And we read that section, and we think about that. He's writing at the early 14th century. Margery Kempe is writing at the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century. And she also travels to Jerusalem. So we're thinking about these spaces that are being occupied by different people. Ibn Battuta tells you all about the splendours of the Dome of the Rock and and what he's seeing, and the sights and sounds of the places, and the ways that we would understand, you know, if you pick up a travel book today, the kinds of things, kind of information that you want about the places that you're in, what you're seeing, and what's beautiful, all those kinds of things. Whereas Margery Kempe gives us a whole different perspective of Jerusalem, right? She's there on a metaphysical plane. She's there in a kind of different kind of, both kind of temporal space and also a kind of a spiritual space too. Yes, maybe we can talk a little bit about Margery Kempe's travels to Jerusalem, but also, well, I don't know if you think about Margery Kempe as a traveller and kind of the kinds of things that kind of are interesting to you, or kind of.
I think one of the really striking things is what's missing from her accounts.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that she doesn't describe it in detail. It's a lot of her journey. So she sometimes gives accounts of difficulties she faces on the journey. For example, you know, when the ship gets blown off course and she ends up in Bergen, but that's represented very much in spiritual terms. You know, this is, you know, sort of God's intervention in a sense, and of course, she's, you know, the ship doesn't sink because, you know, God is on her side. But we don't actually know how she travelled. You know, I assume that she took a boat along the Rhine, but I don't know how she travelled to Italy. I don't know how she crossed the Alps. You know, these sorts of really striking elements of this account are missing because she's so focusing on her spiritual narrative. And it's kind of quite frustrating at times because I suppose as a modern reader, I want to have that detail. I want to know about the practicalities of the travel and what actually happens. And I feel a bit frustrated that that's not there in the narrative.
Yeah, we have to kind of switch to other sources to kind of go, well, this must be what she probably did. But yeah, as Diane says, when we're, and as you were implying, Sara, Shazia, when we're reading about her accounts of Jerusalem, it's much more, and I was at this place, and this is what happened there 1,400 years ago, and talking about, I thought about this, and I thought about Jesus' suffering, and I thought about what it was like for Mary, and I imagined making Mary a cup of tea and all that kind of thing. And it, you know, rather than, and then I had to get my breakfast from this stall, and this is what I ate, you know, which we would like to have that as well. But it is but she's, you know, she's not thinking about what we want. And so that sense of, when she is in those places, that she really sees that collapsing of time is so important to her, that, you know, to go to those places, that allows her to think, really to try to enter into Christ's life, and that is what matters. But I think you know, I do also think about how she did get there, and say, you know, that trip to the Holy Land, and she went to the Holy Land and she went to Italy on the same trip, but then to get to Spain was quite easy. You know, you get, did she go from Bristol? She did, yes. She got the boat over, you know, and you're kind of basically going to the coast of Spain. It's not that far, and it's not that difficult to get to Santiago de Compostela if you're not, unless of course you're walking the Camino, which she was not. You know, she just, so, you know, some of her travels were relatively straightforward. I think that was probably an easier trip than many of her within England trips were.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a fantastic account of when she's travelling back from Prussia, and she ends up having to travel in a cart with some beggars, and they stop and they're sort of picking the nits off themselves. And this is a kind of real low point in her travel. So at that moment, she sort of, I think we've all been there at that point where we've been picking the nits off, but that's a sort of rare moment where she's actually describing the sort of the practicalities of her travel. Again, though it's as an example of sort of her great suffering.
And I think there are so many other really interesting texts and documents where we do get insights into the practicalities of travel. And so one of my favourites is, there are these booklets called the Manières de Langage, which are their phrase books, their language booklets that teach you phrases in other languages. And so in this French language booklet from the 14th century, one of the examples it gives is how to ask someone if they would like to go on a pilgrimage to Canterbury with you. And so it's got this phrase, you know, which is like kind of, you know, it's basically saying, hi, you know, I'm going to go on a pilgrimage to St. Thomas of Canterbury. Would you like to accompany me? And then it's got a phrase of how to get out of it politely. The way that you politely get out, in case this is helpful to anyone, if you don't want to go on holiday with someone, the way to get out of it is to say, well, I would love to, but unfortunately, I have a large inflamed ulcer on my leg. I can show it to you. I'm worried it's going to get gangrenous. then you don't have to go. But those kind of practical details, I think, are just, you know, they're so interesting. Well, there's also a wonderful Pilgrims Guide to Compostela, to a French guidebook that gives you lots and lots of detail about exactly when you're travelling through different places and the rivers and all those kinds of things. And it has this great detail where it says, you've got to be really careful in Navarre because the Navarrese are, you know, they are problematic in all kinds of ways. And the worst thing about them is that they like to give libidinous kisses to the vulvas of women and mules. And then it says they are very like the Scots in their customs and appearance. And this kind of thing, this is a 12th century Pilgrims Guide. You just kind of, what's going on here? So you get this kind of, I don't know, is it really practical advice? I don't know.
So now I've got a practical question. I mean, we're talking about ulcers, but what happens? What happens if you do get sick? So when you,
saint will cure you.
Yeah, saint will cure you. But what do you take? What would you pack with you if you were gonna? Would you be packing bits of kind of? I don't know if we've got detail about kind of the kind of herbs that people might.
There was something in the exhibition about first aid kits, and it included precautionary measures, and it noted contraceptives. And do you remember? And it said it recommended that the woman, if you wanted to use a contraceptive, you wore weasel's testicles pinned about your person. And I think that probably would do the trick.
Hang it around your ulcerous mormel on your leg. Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. What happens if you do get ill? And I mean, I think if you're in one of those pilgrimage sites, there are a lot of hospitals and and people who are used to sick people, because of course a lot of people go on pilgrimage because they are sick and they want to be healed. So I think there would be medical, such as they were, medical practitioners and help for you. But I don't know how much your average person would take with them and how much they would trust to God.
I mean, I imagine that in a sense, because people were relying very much on kind of medicine that they would be making from their kitchen garden, perhaps they might have carried some with them, but I assume they would have felt that they would be able to probably purchase that quite easily on the journey. But yeah, but I like the idea that they might also carry a first aid kit for the sort of absolute essentials.
Like weasel's testicles.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're almost at 8. So I wondered if we've already had so many interesting kind of tidbits from things that we know about women's travels. But maybe we can think a little bit about. I'd love for us to think a little bit about the kinds of documentation we're working with here. So the kinds of things we talked about, pilgrim guidebooks. We know that Margery Kempe has her book that we're thinking about. Poetry we know from. I don't know if there are other kind of forms of documentation. How are we learning about medieval women's travel in the modern day? What kinds of things are you reading?
I think saints' lives as well, because saints' lives often describe journeys. And letters as well is a really important source of information. So I mean, I think that the information that we get about medieval pilgrimages just kind of comes from a whole kind of range of sources of spiritual writings, quite a variety.
And then also the kind of the travelogues and the records of pilgrimages that people write about. There's an interesting one where it's by a man, but he's writing about traveling on the boat, and all the kind of knights on the boat don't want to travel with the old women and shove them out, and the women insist on traveling. And so you get these kind of vignettes in lots of different kind of travel narratives, and lots of people wrote records of their pilgrimages and kind of itineraries of going on pilgrimage. So you have that kind of documentation, as well as the kind of more religious, spiritual focus documentation.
And then, of course, there's Mandeville. I mean, you said you didn't want to mention Mandeville, but Mandeville's account, if Mandeville existed, Mandeville's account of these different routes to Jerusalem, where he talks about there are various different routes you can take. I mean, that starts off very, relatively naturalistic, and then obviously then it becomes more fantasy as it progresses. So there's also that kind of blurring between the sort of travelogue and and fantasy writing that happens, and the Mandeville's Travels is such a good example of.
And of course, our greatest fictional text in English
Yes.
ever is the Canterbury Tales, which is about a pilgrimage. And of course, that's a fictional text, but it is rooted to a certain extent in 14th century life, in the pilgrimage to Canterbury, in going to, approaching that shrine of Thomas Becket, and the figure of the wife of Bath, who is of course an exaggerated female figure, but who does talk about her who we're told about her pilgrimages, that she's looking for her sixth husband, that she's been to Jerusalem, again, in this exaggerated way 3 times. But we have that, and of course now here she is on the more local, but the great national pilgrimage. So that's a different kind of evidence, but maybe speaks to the centrality of pilgrimage, of using pilgrimage as your structural kind of force in that poem.
Yeah, as part of your kind of narrative, as kind
Yeah.
of what catalyses the narrative. Yeah, and I wonder. I mean, we have a travel writer with us here, right? So, and I wonder if there are things that you've learned or discovered about medieval women's travel that made you think about, I don't know, your own process of travel writing, or maybe I don't know how. What is your process of travel writing? If that's a big question.
God knows.
Are there things that you kind of look out for, or things that you?
As I've said, what resonated with me mostly was how very similar things that they notice were to things I try and notice. And I think I've got an awful lot to learn. I mean, there was one in the exhibition who'd had an accident ice skating. Do you remember? She's the patron saint of ice skating now. And she, yeah, she really is. And she was confined to bed for an awful long time and was determined to use the experience of everything she's done once she was still out there ferociously ice skating to internalise all of that and carry on the inner journey. When the body stops travelling, the spirit takes over the trek. It was a man who said that, but there's a great truth in it. And I think that all these women showed so much resilience that when they were down, they weren't out and they carried on. And one can't really learn too much about that. One can't, there's just one has to think about it all the time, and they're there for inspiration. And I think that these medieval women, about whom I didn't know a great deal, and of course, if you don't know something about people, you think they weren't there and they weren't doing things. And this exhibition made me think a bit about that essay. I expect a lot of you read it, published in the 70s by Joan Kelly, Did Women Have a Renaissance? Which was kind of, it created a huge impact because of what the title implies. Did women have a Renaissance? And similarly, to answer your question of what they made me think is, yeah, they were there. It's just I didn't know about them. They were there doing it, trying and struggling, just like we try and struggle. And I find that immensely inspiring.
It's a lovely way to, I think, to open up to kind of questions, I think, and people's kind of thoughts or comments or anything that you'd like. We'd love to be in conversation with you, I think, for the next part of this. I'm looking to. I don't know if we've got a microphone. Yeah. It's just this lady here.
Are there records that they used maps, or were maps accurate enough to use in those periods?
I think the maps weren't accurate enough to use in those periods, and a lot of maps were ideological rather than trying to be representative. There were, so I think that there were more detailed pilgrim guides about you go to this place and then you go to that place. But I think you'd go to the first place, and then people would be telling you how you get to the next place. So you would have quite detailed guides about you have to go here, 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 and here. But I don't think in this area you've got maps that are usable in that way.
The great thing about travelling in the Antarctic is you can kind of be in that same space because there aren't maps there, or not very good ones. Certainly when I was there weren't very many. And I remember once being on a hike and getting out a map that existed that had been made by the USGS. And you could name anything then. Diane is so distinguished. She's got an Antarctic feature named after her, by the way. I remember on this map, there were some features, and there was a very pointy mountain, and geologists had called it the Doesn't Matter Horn. Anyway, I was just about following these topographical features, and I came to a line drawn with a ruler. On one side it was white, and the line said limit of compilation, and I'd reached the end of the map. It's about as good as it gets if you do what I do.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about medieval maps, one of the most famous ones is, of course, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, and I don't think anyone could really use the Mappa Mundi. It's a beautiful, beautiful map, but I don't think it would be very useful to help you find your way around the world, really. As you say, it's much more sort of ideological, with Jerusalem at its centre. It's a way of viewing the world, but not a useful map, not useful as a map for travelling.
So I can see a hand there. There's a hand there. There's a hand there.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. So Sara mentioned Victorian women travellers before, and I know there's quite a lot of examples of women travelling together that may or may not have been having sapphic relations. This is a two-part question, so I wondered if there is any evidence of that during the medieval period, and secondly, are there any accounts of women kind of coming across sort of sexual or romantic practices that they had not been familiar with and kind of commenting on that in any way?
I mean, I think I'm not aware of women describing same-sex or lesbian relationships in specifically in relation to pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. I mean, certainly, we have some accounts of very close relations between women, and we have some quite sort of close friendships being described at times. Especially, if you think about the book of Margery Kempe, there's certainly close friendships between women, but I don't think there's anything in terms of sexual practices that are being described by women that I'm aware of.
No, and I mean, often these kinds of things would be completely elided because we're often told, of women sleeping in the same bed, men sleeping in the same bed. Usually that's not sexual. Sometimes it would have been, but we're not, those kind of details aren't given. And I think the only kind of example of interesting sexual practice on pilgrimage that I particularly know is that mule and human vulva Navarrese practice. Though I don't think the mule and the woman are necessarily there at the same time. Yeah, I don't know. But you can just go to Scotland and ask them. But no, so I don't know of any other examples of that. But I think it is the kind of thing that would be quite unlikely for women to write about, on their pilgrimage.
Thank you. Of the medieval travellers that you've researched and know about, it was obviously you were in a very vulnerable, precarious position as a woman traveller. Were these women all widows, spinsters? Did their husbands allow them to go off on their own, or did they sometimes go as couples? I'm intrigued to know.
You do sometimes...
whether you needed your husband's permission, for example.
You would need your husband's permission. I mean, sometimes you would go... Sometimes people did go as couples, husbands and wives would go together. But, I mean, a priest would... If a woman's needs to get her letter of permission from her priest, the priest's not going to give that letter if the husband is saying they don't want her to go. But married women, you didn't have to be a widow to go, so women would go, married women, and as Margery does.
And indeed, she has to negotiate with her husband to be able to go on that pilgrimage, which involves a sort of exchange of money, basically. But yeah, she wouldn't be able to travel without her husband's permission. And although she does actually, when she travels to northern Germany, she does travel without her confessor's permission, and that then proves problematic. But sometimes, like there were examples from the earlier Middle Ages of women actually being excommunicated because they didn't get permission to travel. From their religious advisors. So it wasn't just a case of having to get your husband's permission, you also would have to get your religious advisor's permission.
There's a really interesting poem from the 15th century called The Good Wife Would a Pilgrimage. So about what sounds like a kind of middle-aged woman who's going on pilgrimage, and she writes an advice letter to her daughter in this poem. It's a poem rather than a kind of historical document. But I mean, one of the things that's interesting about it is that she is heading off, to the Holy Land and, off to kind of have this, holiday and wander about the world. And she says in this poem to her teenage daughter, probably a teenage daughter, now, don't wander about, stay at home. And she says, don't go wandering around the street like a little piglet, like a tiny pig. And I think it's a really interesting poem because she's kind of doesn't see the kind of paradox or the problem that she's kind of like, I'm going to go off and do what I like, but so I think it would be much harder actually for, say, a single young woman to wander about than, this kind of older woman is more able to do that kind of thing. And then, is not kind of thinking I should pass this on to let my daughter have freedom as well.
I think to a certain extent the whole history of women on the road has been the history of men trying to stop them.
So I'm interested in the logistics and the planning. How did women know how to get organized to go on a pilgrimage? Like, before we had the internet, we had travel agents. Like, did they have travel agents? Were there guides that you could hire?
Yeah, there were. So you could, if you got to somewhere, so once you'd got somewhere like Venice, you could get an agent who would book everything for you, who would, book your boat and your accommodation and your guide and your mules or whatever at the other end, and take you around the Holy Land. And you could, and that it was a package, so you could book that kind of thing. I think we have patchy evidence about, how far in advance could you about whether people say here, how far in advance you could get those things set up. And I think you needed to get there, and then you might have had to wait for some time while you got that organised. But it is interesting that it's not that dissimilar from a package kind of deal today.
Just the lady in red there, the red coat.
Hello, I'm quite curious about the language element, because if you're going from England to, say, Rome, you would pass various countries, and how did they understand other people, or like in accommodation, or when they got to Rome, how did they, what was the language kind of barrier like?
I mean, there would be sort of specific hospitals or basically hostels for different nationalities of people. So you would be traveling in a group usually, and so you would travel to the sort of English hospital and stay with your country people, and then you would have guides who would also facilitate some of the linguistic sort of communication issues, really.
And for most of the medieval period, all men with education are trilingual in England, so they've got English, French and Latin. Educated women have got English and French, though they usually don't have Latin. But English people were actually much more competent than most people are today from England. That they actually, they taught languages in those days, and people knew languages better. So I think that did help as well. But there were also these language guidebooks. As I say, there were some language guidebooks with phrases and things, as well as guides. But there's that great scene, isn't there, in Margery Kempe when she's talking to a woman in Rome. Oh, yeah. And they don't have the same language, but they kind of get by through a kind of pidgin. And she reports that the the woman in Rome kind of says to her, Margery in poverty, or something like that.
that's
Like
right.
we do. Like
Yeah,
we do.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of, and then you mime and you gesture. So it's quite a nice little anecdote.
Thank you so much for this. I'm worried about the safety of these women from 1,000 years ago. The world was a dangerous place for women then, as it is now. And how did they manage that? I mean, I'm imagining myself going on one of these journeys, and I'm worried for my own safety. So, what did they do?
Well, I think travelling in groups, again, was really important. Because if you're in a group, that offers you that protection. But certainly, again, to give the example of Margery Kempe, when she separates from the group, that's when she's at her most vulnerable. And even when she's in the group, she's actually vulnerable as well, because she describes on one occasion, a priest steals her blanket. So this is her bedding. So a member of her own group, and a priest at that, takes away her bedding from her. And so there's this argument over the bedding. So even travelling in a group, that obviously didn't offer safety, as it wouldn't necessarily today. You would still be vulnerable to the people around you. But I think that was a sort of major protection. But certainly, the male clerics who would be sort of trying to advise against women travelling would often use the examples of where it not being safe for women. They're likely to be raped and stuff. They're either going to succumb to prostitution and immorality, or they will be raped. And that was an argument that was used against women travelling very often throughout the Middle Ages. But yeah, I think the group travel was probably the safest way, or at least having a guide with you.
And we have examples, like there's a woman called something like Isolde Paraswal in the mid-14th century, and she's paying for an altar back here, which is how we know, in England, which is how we know her story, and she talks about that she's paying for this as thanks for the fact that she escaped a terrible situation when she was in the Holy Land, and she says she was captured and stripped and beaten, and these terrible things happened to her, but then she managed eventually to escape and get to safety. But so we have these kind of partial stories in different places in the historical record that, as you say, you're right to be worried for them. Sometimes, of course, they just pop their cooking pot on their head.
It was also dangerous for men to travel as well. And again, the life of Willibald is particularly interesting there, because Willibald describes how he gets arrested and put in prison, and he's accused of spying, and he's also accused of smuggling. And indeed, I mean, this was a saint. He was in fact smuggling, because he was travelling with some precious balsam, which he'd inside a gourd, and if they'd found it, then he would have been in serious trouble. But fortunately, they didn't think to look inside the gourd, so all was well. He did get released. But you could be, there would be sort of dangerous border crossings. You would be at risk of being seen as a sort of dangerous alien. Somebody who might be spying for another country. So. And that would be true for women as well as men, but perhaps more likely that men would be accused of spying than women. I'm not sure.
And of course, they were also providing a lot of money into the countries that they travelled to. So a lot of people, when they got places, they did want to protect them, because they were going to spend a ton of money when they were there. So they also got protected, but by to a certain extent, by the kind of authorities in different pilgrimage sites.
I think we've got.
We've got some questions from online. Maureen Gilbert asks, please, can you say something about women pilgrims who were not Christian, for example, Hindus, Muslims? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about Muslim women travellers. So there were so in Islam, the pilgrimage site that you go to is in Saudi Arabia. It's in Mecca, and it's the house called the Kaaba, the sacred house of God. And you're asked, as a Muslim, you're asked to go there once in your lifetime on a pilgrimage known as the Hajj, if you're financially able and physically able to do that. And we know that women have always, I guess, travelled on the Hajj to Mecca across the Islamic world. So the Islamic world in the medieval period was vast. It spanned all the way from from Spain, so from Al-Andalus and places like Cordoba and Granada, all the way across into Central Asia. And we know that women were travelling. In order for a Muslim woman to go on Hajj, she has to go with a man, with somebody called a mahram, a companion, and that person has to be either her father or a husband or her brother, somebody who she can't marry. So she can marry a husband, but she couldn't go with, so first, for a cousin, for instance, so you can marry your first cousin in Islam. Male cousin, and we have records of. We don't have as many records in the Islamic world of women travelling. So a woman, probably the longest piece of text that we have comes from the 15th century, from somebody called Aisha al-Ba'unya, who is somebody who comes from Syria, and she also lives in Egypt, and she writes a series of poems about her pilgrimage experience when she moves. You travel across different spaces. So like Ibn Battuta, who travelled across North Africa into Jerusalem and then into Saudi Arabia, she moves into Damascus and then she goes to Mecca and Medina, and she writes this poem about her just the outpouring of kind of spiritual feeling that she gets when she sees the Kaaba, and she's kind of talking to God and asking for forgiveness. But we have records of other women, so kind of fragments of women who are travelling for educational purposes. So you could go on the Hajj. We have as a woman who comes from Afghanistan in the 9th century. Her name's Ali, mother of Ali, and she travels on pilgrimage. She goes for her Hajj, and then she stays in Mecca for about 7 years in order to get a full Islamic education. So she's gone for pilgrimage purposes, but she stays for educational purposes. And we know there are women who go to Mecca and Medina for those educational purposes too. I think we can go back to the live audience now. Does anybody else have any questions?
I just wanted to hear a little bit more about perhaps the financial aspect of it, because presumably you'd need to have quite a bit of money to go on a pilgrimage, particularly if you were traveling for a long time and you were away from your home. And I mean, I guess if you didn't have much money, you could go as a servant, but what would be the demographic?
So, I mean, quite a lot of people think that essentially poorer people and more women are going on the more local pilgrimages. And although you do have women going on all the bigger pilgrimages, that proportionally you're getting more women on the closer by pilgrimages, and also, as I say, more people with less affluence. I think, and we do see so often when we're looking at the kind of documents that we find about particular women pilgrims, it will quite often be, the lady either permission to go with 20 servants and 20 horses, so you'll get these kind of women who are obviously wealthy going on to go to Rome or the Holy Land or something. I mean, that's not, so someone like, Margery, who we've talked about a lot, but, she is a well-off woman, but she's not a duchess, she's a well-off mercantile woman from a mercantile background, she's very comfortably off by any standards. But as I say, she's not the equivalent of like a kind of multimillionaire. So yes, affluent women, but I think all women had access to some form of pilgrimage, even if it's a pilgrimage that is within a day's walk, that's very close. There were, England was full of these kind of little pilgrimage sites.
There's someone at the back
there. I wanted to ask about the reading materials, if we know anything about if they traveled with any texts with them, with prayer books or even records from other people as well.
So I'm not actually, I can't think of any examples of women mentioning travelling with books. I mean, I think it's important to remember that books are very valuable in the Middle Ages. My feeling would be that women, you would be less likely to carry a valuable book of hours with you on pilgrimage. unless you were pretty sure that you were safe. So perhaps very wealthy women would be able to do that. But if you were someone of the sort of more mercantile class, then I think that you wouldn't want to carry too many your valuables with you, because that would make you even more vulnerable to robbery. So I think that I'm fairly confident that aristocratic women would likely travel with their books of hours, because those were the really important religious books for women in the Middle Ages, and they would be in a sort of, because they would be travelling with an entourage, they would be in a much safer environment. So I think partly, but it would be the sort of prayer books, the spiritual books that they would have with them.
But when we think about other forms of travel, so particularly if we think about women who are travelling for marriage, for very high-level marriages, that's when we certainly see a lot of books moving across borders, and that's a really important way in which international kind of literary and artistic culture develops and spreads in the Middle Ages. So, when you think about, the queens of England during this period, when you have people such as Philippa of Hainaut or Anne of Bohemia, they're coming to England with entourages who are full of poets and artists. They're bringing books, they're bringing poetry, they're spreading, different kinds of culture. So women, so there are other forms of women travelling which are facilitating all kinds of literary exchange.
And music, of course, they would also be bringing the music with them. So again, the cultural exchange in that form.
What did they wear? And how, presumably, they washed their clothes from time to time in rivers along the way. What would they wear on their feet? I mean, these would be important considerations today for long-distance walking.
Yeah, there were particular pilgrim robes, weren't there? We can see York's got a lovely pilgrimage window in York Minster, hasn't it? And you can see a female pilgrim donor and also a male pilgrim donor in the window, and they wear a kind of particular pilgrim's robe, and there were particular pilgrim kind of clog shoes, weren't they? I can't remember what you actually called them, but there were particular kinds of shoes that they wore. I don't know that they would have washed their clothes very much, though.
And hats would have been really important as well, as especially if you're travelling to hotter climates. And in the famous Middle English poem Piers Plowman, there's a description, it's a male pilgrim, but there's a description of the pilgrim who's absolutely covered in the pilgrimage badges. We mentioned that you'd buy these pilgrimage badges, but you then attach them to your pilgrimage robes. And so the sort of it's almost like a caricature of the pilgrim, festooned in the badge in his pilgrim badges.
Thank you. Travel to this day can be life-changing and can expand your minds. And I just wonder if some of these women wrote about what lessons they'd learned during their travels, and if when they came back home, whether they felt dissatisfied, perhaps, with their lives.
I think for Margery Kempe, it's very transformative in the sense that she had such an intense religious experience that it framed her religious devotion going forward when she came home from the pilgrimage, really so profoundly, the way that she expressed herself for her. Margery would express herself through sort of screaming and crying, which was very disruptive for her fellow pilgrims, and also when she came home was very disruptive for the people around her back home. But that was a really important way for her to express herself spiritually. So I think Margery Kempe had a really kind of profound experience of pilgrimage. But in terms of sort of reflections on pilgrims who've returned, this isn't quite answering your question, but I think it's a key point that sometimes people went on pilgrimage multiple times. So we have accounts of women who return from pilgrimage and then a few years later they go on pilgrimage again. So they're obviously finding it a sort of very rewarding and fulfilling experience that they want to repeat it. So I think from that perspective, perhaps for some women, once they start going on pilgrimage, that becomes an important something important to them in their life going forward, to keep on doing it again and again. It's not just a sort of one-off pilgrimage, it's the beginning of a life of travel.
I think we're at time now, but thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful, wonderful questions. Thank you for being here and for engaging with us. Thank you very much to Sara, Diane and Marion for a wonderful conversation and some wonderful vignettes and anecdotes and learning about women on the move. Thank you very much.